All right, welcome back to Fundamentals of Philosophy. We're still in Module 2 on reasoning, and this is part 2 of our 3-part lecture series in which we're going to be talking about induction, or inductive reasoning. In part 1, we took a brief trip through the genealogy of deductive logic, its history, development, and scope. In part 2, we will examine inductive reasoning, in particular its relevance to the testing of scientific hypotheses. As in part 1, it is recommended that you refer to the handout to help organize and flesh out the terminology and concepts. Consider that a constant, especially when we're dealing with these sorts of fairly in-depth, logical, conceptual territory. The world is a precarious place, as any animal in the wild knows. The ability to reliably predict what will happen next can mean the difference between life and death. Pick one mushroom and you will be fed. Pick another and you will die. Pick a third and nature will have many new sights to show you. The ability to infer the potential outcomes of alternative possible actions matters. As the pragmatist philosopher John Dewey, one of my favorite philosophers, noted, the quest for certainty is really a retreat from uncertainty. It's an attempt to escape from the very real danger of being living meat in a hungry world. Deduction can provide us with certainty, but it's a narrow kind of certainty. If you understand the terms used in a logical syllogism, and you slot them correctly into a valid inferential form, then you will arrive with mathematical precision at a necessary truth. But such truths tell us nothing that we do not already know. Nothing that was not already contained within the definitions of the terms themselves. Form without content is empty. To reappropriate a bit of Kant. So if we want to learn new facts about things in the world, new facts about the content of our theories, then we have to leave behind the logical notation, just for a minute, set it down, leave it by the armchair, and go to the world itself. We have to go to experiment. We have to go to experience. We have to test our hypotheses against the red teeth and bloody claws of nature itself. We have to risk failure. Discovery emerges from uncertainty. The knowledge that is provided by deductive reasoning is sometimes called a priori knowledge. And these are terms that will come back around, a priori and a posteriori. So I'm introducing them here so that they'll sort of already be in place when we need them later. But the knowledge that is provided by deductive reasoning is sometimes called a priori knowledge, from the Latin for from what is earlier. Knowledge is a priori if it can be arrived at prior to and independent of experience. So you don't need to test it against the world, you know it. That's deductive logic. It comes from the terms and their relations, formal structure. Knowledge provided by inductive reasoning, by contrast, is a posteriori, which comes from the Latin for from what comes after, meaning is knowledge that is arrived at after and as the result of experience. So, unlike deductive reasoning, which works from the top down, inductive reasoning works from the bottom up, beginning with particular instances, particular cases, and deriving from them a general conclusion. So you start with the particular, you move to the general, the opposite of deduction. Another way of thinking about this is that deduction moves from the abstract to the concrete, while induction moves from the concrete to the abstract. We witness patterns in nature, right? We drop a glass and it falls to the ground and shatters. We drop 100 glasses and they all fall to the ground. We conclude that these experiences are telling us something important about the relationship between things being dropped and things falling to the ground, right? This is inductive reasoning, the foundation of the scientific method. We assume that all things being equal, the future will most likely resemble the present. We assume that our experiences of singular events, or even patterns of events, aren't just random chance occurrences, just weird one-off anomalies, but represent predictable and testable regularities about the world itself, right? We assume, in other words, that the world is rational, that it is the sort of thing that can be comprehended through reason. If this were not the case, then the events in our lives would be entirely unpredictable and forever beyond our control, and our lives would be perpetually at the arbitrary mercy of pitiless gods, the mercy of the fates, and random chance. But here's the trade-off. There's always a trade-off, right? Induction can expand our knowledge of the world, but it can never provide us with actual certainty. If you see 1,000 white swans over the course of your life, and never a swan of another color, you would be justified, based on the evidence, in making the inductive inference that all swans are white. This argument is cogent, which means it arrives at a strong conclusion based on accurate evidence. Cogency. It is also, as it turns out, false. Black swans exist. They're just very uncommon. The medieval theologians, who developed modus ponens and modus tollens, recognized this, that any hypothesis may be refuted conclusively by a single counterexample. But no hypothesis can ever be confirmed decisively by any number of supporting observations. There could always be a black swan around the corner. As Albert Einstein once put it, no amount of experimentation can ever prove me right, but a single experiment can prove me wrong. What repeated observations can provide is corroboration. A hypothesis is corroborated when it survives repeated tests designed to refute it, where other competing hypotheses have failed. They have not been corroborated. This sort of sustained experimental corroboration increases what's called our credence, or degree of confidence in the hypothesis. Notice that we're now out of certainties and into probabilities. If a hypothesis has high credence relative to competing hypotheses, then we are warranted in accepting it as what's called an inference to the best explanation, sometimes also called abductive reasoning, sometimes separated out from induction as its own thing. Here we're going to kind of treat them together. But regardless of how much compelling evidence we observe, we can never reach certainty. Only probability. All inductive arguments are open to potential revision in the light of new evidence. And this is not a bug. This is a feature. It's called fallibility, and it's how science progresses. This is how Kant called it an ampliative property. It's how we can add to our knowledge. It's through that fallibilism, through the fact that there can always be another experiment that shows us that we don't know everything that we think we know. Back to that epistemic humility of Socrates. And this sort of scientific progress is exactly what the philosopher Carl Hempel wanted to understand. Hempel emerged, and this Hempel is from your readings. The Semmelweis case is Carl Hempel. He's the one writing it up and talking about the sort of analyzing it from a logical and empirical perspective. Hempel emerged out of the logical positivist tradition that dominated Anglo-American philosophy in the early 20th century. The logical positivists were driven by the desire, inspired by the early works of Russell and Wittgenstein, to elevate professional philosophy to the same level of rigor and authority as the empirical sciences. The development of first and second order predicate logic had increased the analytical power of formal logic dramatically, and philosophers were now able to examine scientific principles with a new level of clarity and precision. Hempel's covering law model of scientific explanation attempts to unify the mathematical certainty of deduction with the predictive power of induction to derive a set of general laws of scientific explanation from the observed practices of working scientists. And there's going to be a lot more detail about this stuff in the handout. I'm going to kind of just give a gloss or an overview of it in the lecture. The crucial part of this model, of the covering law model, also called the nomological deductive model, crucial part of this is what Hempel called the hypothetico-deductive model. He was terrible at naming things. The hypothetico-deductive model, which illustrates step by step the process of hypothesis testing employed by working scientists. For greater detail about both models, please consult the handout. All of this brings us to the tragic tale of the 19th century physician Ignaz Semmelweis. So Hempel uses Semmelweis, the Semmelweis case, as a demonstration of the covering law model in action. The phenomenon requiring explanation in this case involved a large discrepancy in mortality rates from childbed fever between two similar maternity wards. Semmelweis identified a number of variables that could be tested. For example, the position of the mothers during delivery differed between the two wards. From this, a hypothesis and a potential implication follow. And again, the structure of this is in the handout. If the mothers in the different wards are placed in the same birthing condition, then the difference in mortality rates should change, right? If that hypothesis is true, if that is really the factor that's driving the difference. If that's the difference that makes a difference. Semmelweis tests this hypothesis and analyzes the results. In this case, there is no significant difference in the outcome. Mortality rates stay constant, really high over here, really low over here. So the hypothesis is considered disconfirmed. This is the one test that can disprove. Semmelweis returns to the initial conditions. He goes back to the start. The logical algorithm of hypothesis formulation restarts, returns to the beginning. It's an iterative process. Each time you run the program, you run through the steps. If you disconfirm the hypothesis, you start over, return to start. If this inference pattern looks familiar, it's because it's a pretty straightforward example of modus tollens, which we've talked about a few times now, or disconfirming the consequent, as we discussed in part 1. The machinery of hypothesis testing runs and reruns its hypothetico-deductive program until Semmelweis eventually discovers a variable that makes a relevant difference. In the ward with the lower mortality rate, the deliveries are performed by midwives. In the ward with the higher mortality rates, the deliveries are performed by doctors. Now, according to what passes for common sense in the 19th century, this is the opposite of what people would expect, right? Doctors, they're highly educated men of great professional status, while midwives are typically poor and uneducated women. So you'd think the highly educated doctors would be the ones with the low mortality rates because they have all the knowledge and skill. But Semmelweis identified a crucial variable among the initial conditions. The midwives in the ward routinely washed their hands. This made sense. The common sense of practical men at the time dictated that the hands of the laboring underclasses would be dirtier than the skilled hands of professional doctors, right? Makes sense. And so the doctors routinely moved from performing autopsies on childbed fever victims in the morgue directly to delivering babies in the maternity ward without first pausing to practice any sanitation, without washing their hands, sanitizing their hands, content in the knowledge that dirty hands were the sort of thing that only happened to poor people. So keep in mind, when this is happening, Semmelweis's experiments are occurring years before Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch would develop the germ theory of contamination. At the time, the dominant explanation for disease transmission was something called the miasma theory, which suggested that contagion was spread through bad air or noxious vapors. The notion of invisible particles that can get on your hands, I mean, that wasn't on anyone's radar. That wasn't part of the conceptual scaffolding. The conceptual scaffolding required to suggest that contagion could be spread by unsanitized hands, it wasn't in place yet. It didn't exist. There was no way to draw that conclusion. There were no tools. Until Semmelweis. Regardless, this was the variable that generated a successful test implication by radically reducing the mortality rates, the difference in mortality rates between wards. Therefore, according to the covering law model of Hempel, the general explanatory law follows that improper sanitation increases mortality. In medical situations, it receives strong corroboration from this and gains greater overall credence. Again, not certainty, but it's corroborated and gains credence. Ironically, the form of the argument that Semmelweis employs here, if P, then Q, Q, therefore P, is one that we've seen before as well, probably in the handouts. It is, in fact, a specific case of the logical fallacy known as affirming the consequent that we talked about in part 1. Thus, it represents a deductive inference that is technically invalid. It cannot provide bulletproof certainty, deductive certainty. And yet, this invalid inference has held strong through countless attempts at disconfirmation. It was instrumental in the eventual development of the germ theory of contamination. It may hold strong until the end of time, but it can never provide absolute bulletproof certainty. All that we are entitled to from the Semmelweis case or any similar cases and its subsequent corroborations is an inference to the best explanation that improper sanitation can result in sickness or death in medical contexts. That's it. Based upon his findings, Semmelweis became a relentless advocate for the importance of antiseptic hand washing to prevent the spread of contamination. Something that we sort of take for granted now, right? However, at the time, his work was considered primarily experimental rather than theoretical. He didn't really have any sort of robust mechanism in place or theory about the transmission itself beyond speculating that invisible cadaverous particles were being carried by the doctors from the morgue to the maternity ward. At the time, again, the miasma theory was dominant, so this didn't fit within that. And against a background that was informed by the conceptual scaffolding of miasma theory and sort of 19th century class and gender politics, the suggestion that it was the doctors who were transmitting contagious materials through the lack of proper sanitation habits faced intense institutional resistance and even outrage from the medical community. How dare you, sir, suggest that the hands of doctors were as unclean as those of the laboring classes, as those of midwives, of women. This was viewed as an attack on the prestige and the dignity of the profession. Worse, Semmelweis seemed to be kind of suggesting that doctors were knowingly placing their patients in danger by not taking his advice. Now that they know this, now that the case has been established, any doctor who's not sanitizing their hands is just kind of killing someone. It's just kind of preventing possible murder. Anyway, frustrated by the institutional resistance to his empirical findings, Semmelweis's advocacy became increasingly combative. He was not so much good at the communication, the rhetoric, the argumentation side of things. He would not have made a good sophist. As a result, Semmelweis was eventually dismissed from his professional position. He was fired and ultimately committed forcefully and against his will to an asylum. They locked him up for suggesting that people wash their hands before delivering babies. While institutionalized in an asylum, Semmelweis suffered systematic physical abuse, resulting, ironically, in an infected wound in his hand which became septic, leading to his death from the very form of contamination that he had spent decades attempting to diagnose and treat. History likes ironies for some reason. Like Socrates, Semmelweis employed impeccable logic in his investigations. His experiments were supported by overwhelming evidence, but in the end, none of that mattered. And Semmelweis, like Socrates, was sent to his death for the crime of coming up with a good idea at the wrong time. Because logical rigor and empirical evidence are not always sufficient. In the real world, inferential engines compete with established prejudices. Valid arguments sometimes break on the stones of institutional authority. Sometimes truth dies in an asylum, and the common sense of practical men prevails and takes the day. All of which sets us up for part 3, where we will gaze more deeply into the abyss of power and its influence on the manufacturing of truth. See you there.